President Obama outlined his campaign to combat the terror threat posed by ISIS, saying the U.S. will join a broad coalition, but insisting that the offensive against the militants will not involve U.S. combat troops. So what can we expect from this so-called broad coalition? How effective will it be? John Bolton is a former U.S. ambassador to the UN and a Fox News contributor. Ambassador, good to see you this morning. We're hearing the word broad, but I haven't heard a lot of specific names mentioned. I know various members of the administration have been across Europe and the Middle East trying to build this coalition. Who's in? Are we ready for this?
Well, bearing in mind it's still early days, the final returns on in, I think the effort is pretty weak at this stage. If you look at the meeting on the margin of the NATO summit in Great Britain, there were 9 other countries there, 8 NATO members in Australia. But, you know, there are 28 members in NATO, so somehow we lost 2/3 of them. And even those that are part of the so-called coalition, like Germany and amazingly Great Britain, have said they will not participate in airstrikes over Syria. Now, this week, Secretary Kerry has been in the Middle East trying to drum up Arab and Turkish support. But even this morning, the New York Times headline describes support from the group that Secretary Kerry was meeting with as tepid, because nothing specific about dealing with ISIS was really included in their communique. So right now it looks like a pretty unilateralist approach by the president, but a weak and inconclusive one at that.
Well, and I think back to some of the efforts we've had to make in that region, specifically to the administration of President Bush 41. And if I remember, for a good chunk of that, you were in the State Department. Something that 41 is very well remembered for is his ability to build coalitions and to do so quickly and effectively and keep them together through an offensive. What kind of skill set does that take, and can this administration do it?
Well, I think between President Bush 41 and Secretary of State James Baker, they did a fantastic political job of building and keeping the coalition together. And it started with being able to define very precisely what your objective was and what you were prepared to do to carry it out. In that case, it was removing Saddam Hussein's forces from Kuwait, liberating Kuwait. And we had a coalition that they put together that spanned really all over the world. But it takes a president who is willing to spend an awful lot of time on it. At the State Department, the careerist used to call President Bush 41 the mad dialer, because he was always on the phone and he produced results. So if we had a president doing that, I think we'd be in different shape potentially.
All right, looking at what we are now facing with ISIS and now these elevated estimates of how many thousands of fighters they have spread across that region, what kind of coalition do we need to come together? If we're going to say, hey, we're going to supply the air support, but we're going to enable and equip and help others on the ground, you know, who in that region do we need to absolutely be on board so that if that is the plan, it's a successful one?
Well, I think that's a major part of the reason that the coalition is so weak and amorphous, because that's not enough of a role for the United States. And I know nobody wants to talk about boots on the ground, but honestly, does any of us really want to be attacked by ISIS? I think the Arab states in particular are very leery of a commander-in-chief who doesn't seem to know his own mind. And I think it follows almost inexorably that weak leadership produces weak followership. And that's what we're seeing certainly in the Middle East.
Very quickly, can you touch on the role of Saudi Arabia? We understand that they are open now to some role in training ground forces that would go against ISIS. Talk about our relationship with them and what role they could play here.
Well, I think in many senses this is Saudi policies coming home to roost. They should be very worried about an Islamic terrorist state near their border, because I think the regime itself could be threatened. So among other things the Saudis can do is pay for 50% of this operation. They can certainly provide military assistance, and they ought to be doing a lot of the financing to arm the Kurds, the Peshmergas, forces from the Kurds, Sunni Arabs in western Iraq, and those remaining moderates, if we can find them, from the Syrian opposition. So I think Saudi role could be very large. But what they're looking for is leadership. This tepid Arab response we saw is because they're hedging their bets, which may sound incredible, but when they see an uncertain trumpet from Washington, it's not hard to understand why.
Ambassador Bolton, good to see you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Shannon.